Just with reference to the specific case studies that we saw, I was wondering, in practical terms, could the speakers maybe suggest one action that could be implemented to translate the experience or the lessons learned from these case studies into either European Commission, departmental or local authority structures?
Great. Okay. One action. Who wants to kick off? Go ahead.
I suppose for us the one action was, and I see James Moran here today, the one action for the Ireland Life project was sitting down with the farmers on the 3 islands for a meeting, asking them, look, what do you think needs to be done? Which for one, you got good ideas from, but also in the implementation of the project, if somebody comes on, that's stupid, why are you doing that? It comes back, well, this is what came, this is what was needed. Now you may have to develop and you do your own things, but it does help greatly in the running of it if you take that time and have the meetings and say, right, what do you see as the issues and how do you see them as being created? Now some of the ideas that come up are not possible, do you know, like maybe sea erosion or something like that. There's nothing you can do about that, but there are other things that you can say, we'll try that. One of the things that we had was to try to get the rye going back in, you know, to get the small scale tillage, which is important in the agricultural system of the islands. But you go to EU for funding and they'll say, so you're going to dig up these calcareous grasslands to put rye into them, do you know? That's not what we're about, you know. So, but still, you still get enough ideas from the local community to implement a project.
Great. Anything else? Anybody else? Yeah.
Have an absolutely dedicated resource in all projects about communication and education, and have specialists delivering it. In other words, don't expect people like me who've done their bit on grassland to be able to communicate that effectively, but have people who are professionals in the business to do that job, and put the resources into having them there specifically, both education and communication.
Anyone else with an excellent action?
Yeah, I think maybe just the delivery of funding, I think a bit of an understanding that the actual money itself, when it comes to carrying out an action, say removal of invasive scrub, can potentially be a tool in itself. Instead of having to advertise the money at tender level, I know you have to adhere to financial controls of the European government, but potentially if you could direct that money to individual landowners to carry out the works themselves, and that funding then becomes an additional tool to motivate and to engage people in the community. Just more flexibility around that spending, I think.
I think that before you go looking for international funding, I think to build up your own resources within your own partnership, and look at your partnership and see how you might be able to expand that and bring in more partners, because I think other projects could benefit from that. So I would focus on building up your own partnership, particularly partners who can bring some resources to bear. And even though small amount of resources, when you pool it together, you can achieve something locally, and then look for more international funding.
Sort of coming from the other side, from a government department, just listen to really rock solid good examples at a local level. From the state's point of view, I think trying to get funding to local authorities or related bodies is so useful in terms of pushing forward biodiversity generally and possibly within Natura. And we've got a small amount which would be right into the local authorities about to fund heritage officers' work this year, and also invasive species. It's very small, but I'm hopeful that again that there's just a change in the mood, that we will be trying to get more of that money and then give it to people who actually are geared up to go and understand the local issues.
Right. Yeah.
From the European perspective, it's very hard to give one single action or recommendation. I mean, all that has been said, I think, is most relevant to this work. Maybe one kind of key word is integrated management, since we're talking about areas designated for some purpose. So integrated management is a kind of buzzword, keyword and buzzword as well. And of course, integration means it's not only with culture, it's also with agriculture, it's also with recreational activities, with some kind of housing development, all kinds of other infrastructure. So this integrated has to take on board the various socioeconomic needs and activities, and how all that can then be compatible or support the nature conservation purposes. So it's a concept which is there, nobody I think would argue against, but still it's very hard to implement in practice. But since we're talking in particular about cultural assets and values in this concept, I think trying to implement this concept in relation to culture, I think one of the speakers mentioned that we're still lacking a kind of good understanding of what we mean by cultural assets. I mean, habitats, at least there is kind of classification, the UNIS classification, we have the Habitats Directive with its annexes. So we have a kind of more or less agreed definition with all the, of course, the caveats in terms of biology and all that. But we don't have that when it comes to cultural assets. We're talking about, in the context now of the European year, about tangible and intangible cultural assets. They can include a vast array of things, from monuments and archaeological sites down to traditional practices. I mean, turf cutting was mentioned, I think, by one of the speakers as a traditional cultural asset. I would have personally some questions about that, but still, I mean, all that I think needs somehow to be better elaborated and worked out. What do we mean by that, and then how to define then these links, the conflicts, the priorities. You need sometimes to make some decisions and all that. So it's not the one answer to, to the question, but I would put under the integrated management concept.
Yeah. So maybe a map where we don't just have little symbols for different habitat types, but we have symbols for traditional music, stories, particular area of the world. I think it's Slieve Lucra, where I come from, down in North Cork. We could have a whole bunch of those kind of cultural interest points over that landscape. Is culture a good way into nature conservation? So that's, I think that was capturing Declan's. And how do we actually draw people in to this area of natural and cultural heritage in a really strategic way? Open to the panel. We'd like to tackle that. There was the last part was aimed specifically to you, Kieran. So
yeah, and just to refer back to Declan, by the way, about rangers and possibly having more culture. The rest we had a proposal about, I don't know, 20 years ago that the conservation rangers would do every aspect of heritage. They'd do archaeology and everything else, and you can imagine the unions got agitated. And I think it wasn't worth fighting over, but it is a good idea. On the woodlands thing, just to say, again, I think an awful lot of this is act local, and a lot of that hopefully will emanate from local authorities and local interest groups further. Going back to the culture thing, I mean, I think I haven't gotten into studying. It's something I'm going to do, is have a look within our departmental structure to see, well, how did they, what was the shift that enabled them to get the resources, because it does take, you need the resources people, and you need clever people, not just anybody, specialists in the field, and I'm not quite sure how that happened. And I think across organisations you probably need to do that. There's a sort of a tradition as a civil servant, I know, and anybody else who's worked in the civil service will know, that there's a press office always, but the press office is entirely focused on the minister and the minister's message. And their job is not to sort of talk about saving the pine marten, generally speaking, unless there's a good news story or something like that. So I'm interested to see, and I don't know the answer really, so I'm saying to you, but possibly look to assigning money very specifically to having people with those skills, and not just a press function, but a
communications and engagement function. Yeah.
Can I be really greedy? And one of the things that we didn't mention at all, a huge cultural asset in Ireland is sport, and within that, the huge thing is the GAA. And I just wonder, we never mentioned sport at all, and I just wonder, is there anything are there any examples of where sporting clubs, groups, whatever, had a role to play? And if I may, just one really interesting example. I got contacted by a politician some years ago about a proposal to develop a football pitch on one of the islands. I can't remember, was it the Aran Islands or somewhere else? And it was on a MACR, which is priority habitat and so on. But his point, the politician who contacted me was very good. He said, you need football to keep young lads on the island. And if you don't have young lads on the island, you won't have young girls on the island. And the population will die. And he said, this sounds bizarre, but that football pitch really could make a difference. And it might be worth your 150 square metres or whatever it was of Mancare in order to do all the other things that you want to do. So it's a thing that always stuck with me.
Yeah, I like that idea of the relational value of football pitches for maintaining populations.
Oh, from Mancare.
A service that I never knew Mancare provided. Any other responses to those points? One about culture as a way into getting people engaged with nature in the local areas, and how do we more strategically communicate the values, I guess.
I suppose we learned a lot of that because in life we have a social media thing that we put through, and you come and you say, that's really interesting, that. So I got a picture of an oak, eagle, or moth, and thought, yeah, lovely picture, great thing, put it on. Not an interest, not a look at, We put a picture of a farmer building a rain catcher. It reached 9,000 people in 2 days,
Yeah.
And as a result, we have changed totally the way we aim. Now, we still throw one in every now and again that we know mightn't be, but we have this people.
Yeah.
But we learned an awful lot of what people look at on social media and what they don't look at.
Yeah.
And if you ignore that, you're not getting your message across whatsoever. And it's not what you think people should see, It can be other things altogether.
Okay. Any other responses?
Just very briefly, because I think the contributions from the floor are much more interesting than anything I have to say, and I hope you're capturing all of that as well. But I go back to this thing about communicating the connections, and if you think of the culture and the success of culture, but nearly all the cultural inspiration we get, or the artistic inspiration, and art is only part of culture, just the way heritage is part of culture, if you want to get into the debate. The inspiration for that comes from nature. It comes from the natural aspects. You go to any exhibition, art display, whatever object it is, whatever tool it is, whatever is in the museum, the inspiration of it has come from nature. And we have to find some way of making that connection much more explicit. And Kieran's quite right too. I think the structures that we have, from a political level right through a departmental level, are far too fragmented at the moment, and whilst we're all working to try and make the connections, we're struggling because I think that at the top level there's much too fragmentation, and the Minister for Heritage really isn't responsible, whether it's natural or cultural heritage, for all aspects of heritage. So at the top we haven't got the connection, if you like, the queen bee. So everything else starts to fragment underneath, and I think there's a new National Heritage Plan being developed. Make sure that you all act by making your points that I've been hearing today, that the department is developing, and make sure that it's not a National Heritage Plan that is devised in silos to protect particular aspects, whether it's monuments, whether it's habitats or whatever, but that it actually relates back into culture. That's an opportunity, and we have to get it right this time, as I say, or else the future does become too late.
We are running, yes, Beatrice.
Could I just take advantage of the microphone and just say, as part of the European year, we're doing a lot of communications training, starting with my colleagues in the Heritage offices, many of whom are here today, because in the heritage world we don't have the communication skills. And I'm just picking up very much what Patrick said there. It's not about what we think, it's what people are interested in, and we have to, there are now, communications has got much more complex. You're working through so much more noise. And really, maybe that's something that in ways a secret legacy of this year is we're hoping is to improve skills generally. So we might enlarge that as well. And the other thing is the cultural people would always say, oh, look at the wildlife side. Everybody loves wildlife. And you may not realise it, that actually I'm laughing, listening, because I'm going, I've been to the counter so often. When we actually do surveys about what people are interested in, they are interested in, well, what they call wildlife. They don't call it biodiversity. I mean, there is a problem of language, but people relate very much, particularly to their local environment. And that is something, and again, I don't think most people split it up, that is the problem, is it fragments as we go up, but we know it isn't on the ground, and people, whether it's walking along their own, a beach in their area or a river or what a bog or whatever. That's what sort of how people engage, and I think we need to start from that point again as well, and maybe work on the politicians now.
Integrated management, we knew how to do it 30 years ago. We need both bottom-up approaches and top-down structures. Linking, I think, to Michael's vision of a piece of legislation, a Landscapes Act. Lichens can be good and bad. don't be so good.
It's no bad. Xanthoria rules. That's it.
And the third point was we need clarity around the cultural practices, in particular in relation to the designation and that article, and which cultural practices can affect a designation and which can't. I think was that comment. And Eamon's points at the end there. What is the destination? Where is the EU trying to get to with this combination of natural cultural heritage? What is the kind of one sentence vision? And what are the funding mechanisms that will enable local communities to really engage with the natural and cultural heritage and to get value from all of the conventional conservation work, I guess, that goes on? Any takers?
Where to begin? Well, we should defer to Brussels, shouldn't we?
I have to go.
Oh no, you have to go first now. Maybe the final questions at the end.
Yeah.
Funding. Let's start with that one. Yeah.
Let me start. Well, first in relation to this Article 2 of the Habitats Directive, which says that measures have to take into account social, economic, regional and cultural requirements. Well, basically we have a kind of standard approach to that, developed over the years, that the designation of the sites per se has to be based entirely on the intrinsic ecological values of the sites. It is something which has been confirmed by the court several times. So when it comes to identifying the sites which qualify for Natura designation, then it's clear this has to be entirely on the basis of their ecological values. However, when it comes to the actual protection and management of the sites, of course, all these socio-economic considerations, including the cultural and regional particularities and needs, can and have to be taken into account if management is to be successful. And this, of course, boils down to the engagement with stakeholders, with people, with landowners, etc., etc. So I think this is clear, at least in theory, clear. And of course, all the work of the Commission, together with the countries and authorities and stakeholders and NGOs, it is trying to do over the last 25, 30 years, trying to make this famous network work in practice. Of course, the key word would be working with people. Not against, not without, not above or but together. And of course, it's much easier to say than to do, but it remains still I think the key word. So this applies also to this aspect of cultural requirements. How are they to be taken into account for the management? I think this, I don't have an answer to that, but I would expect this to be one outcome or one recommendation from ongoing activity that we're doing at European level, trying to see how the synergies can be reinforced mutually, where the opportunities but also the limitations, and then this could give a kind of recommendation, kind of good practice, I don't know how to call this, guidance, whatever, on how this cultural dimension can be best integrated in the management. So this links actually to the question, which is I think a very valid question, it's not a hard question. Eamon, it's a very valid question. Where do we want to go with all this? I could easily answer, well, what we want to do is, of course, to enhance all communication opportunities. And the fact that now, on the occasion of the European year, the two communities, I mean, the conservation community and the cultural community, have some opportunities to get closer together. Already this, I think, is a already tangible benefit. from that, but we're still far from getting there. I see this kind of silo, I think it was mentioned, silo thinking. It is there. We can notice that also in some official meetings we have, that people tend to think of from their own angle of view. So this could be already a positive outcome. Where do we want to go? I mean, the management of the sites is, I would say, is the easy answer. We want to increase opportunities for more effective management of the sites, including communication, including effective conservation action, including better communication, including better financing opportunities. Showcasing the case studies then is a way to show that these things, they can happen. Showcasing the benefits, the mutual benefits, of course. Always we tend to focus too much on the positive aspects, but let's not forget the difficulties. I think this could guide us. Where would we like to go? The financing aspect, indeed. Well, we're now in the period where the new multi-annual financial framework is being shaped within the Commission. The key DGs, in charge of financing, meaning DG Regio, DG Agri, DG Mare, are in full steam right now, drafting proposals, and there is a lot of internal discussion. So I cannot really say too much more about that because everything is still in the make. And from our perspective, our aim is, of course, to secure as much as possible financing opportunities for the protected areas, and this, I think, would also, to some extent, benefit also the cultural dimension within those areas. The LIFE program, again, it's one of those instruments whose future is not guaranteed. It is guaranteed. The future is guaranteed. What is not guaranteed is the shape of the instrument. There are ideas out there about, for example, a nature fund. All of a sudden, the new German government has launched this on the table. It's there. It's interesting. The idea to increase the budget for LIFE is also there. It's in the action plan, and we do hope that this will materialize. And of course, in relation to the other EU funds, how we can best use them, the debate is there. There is no concrete, for the moment, idea. What I can really tell you and confirm is that our DG, and in particular our department, is struggling really very hard right now, trying to secure that that the nature conservation needs are embedded in all the future financing, European financing instruments. And in that respect, we're also very much keen to get this new, this new generation of PAFs, of prioritized action frameworks, in place sooner than later. We consider the PAFs not only as an instrument for the authorities to identify priorities, but also a very good argument to show, well, these are the needs. If we are serious about nature conservation, if we are serious about working with people, then we need to secure the necessary funding, including the share from the EU funds. So that's a bit where we stand with that.
Very briefly, again, just to pick up on the funding thing, we need to try to get more investment in people to actually do things, rather than capital monies sort of that are not necessarily supported by people then doing anything afterwards. I don't know whether I'm making that clear, but in Ireland our model, it's easy to get capital money to go and build something or do something, and indeed the cultural plan that has just been announced, not that I would ever be critical of anything government does when it's putting so much money in, but it's really just paying catch up in terms of investing in the cultural institutions. But there's very little current money there to actually improve either the connections with people or the way in which people do things. And I think that's something that I would like to see happen, that the deficit in current funding to do educational things, to do what would be regarded as the communication things, to do what would be the connecting with people things that are, if you like, I hate to say it, but sort of viewed as being softer, that there's actually a commitment from government to fund agencies and NGOs and people to do those sorts of things. And it can be done. Very briefly, the Irish Wall Towns Network, when we proposed 10, 15 years ago to set that up, we were offered a pot that was capital, and we were told you could only use it to build and help restore the walls. We said, we don't want it. Give it to somebody that just wants to restore the walls. We want a portion of that to be for festivals, for educational programs, for research, for all that is good about education, so that we can communicate. And so far the model has worked, much reduced in terms of the available funds, but that's something that we can all insist on, I think, when we're devising our programs. And I know that it's something that the department is acutely aware of, and I think that, you know, if it's coming from you into us as well as us to the department, and the department appreciates that, then we can change the funding model, because that softer money is what's needed.
Okay, yeah.
Just one quick point, like when we do decide where we want to go, and everyone on the island is going to be on that bus going in that direction, and everybody on that bus has to be told where they're going, like, and that's just, as Michael, as you said, communication, it's so important. Communication is a specific skill. Like, I'm trained as a scientist and I do communication. I am not trained as a communicator. I can do add-on communication skills, but it's a specific task. And to give you an example of, under the CAN project, between our 14 different partners, how our communication works. Communication basically is carried out ad hoc by the individual partners. We have one communication person employed by Newry, Mourne and Down County Council, and they work 2.5 days a week. And their job is to tender for the website production, to produce leaflets. Their job isn't to meet people on the ground, so there needs to be more money spent so everybody knows where they're going, and it'll avoid. We've learned the lessons of lack of communication, we just need to make sure we don't repeat those.
Yeah. Okay, great. Now I'm very aware of time, and it's now 5 to 2, and you have 5 minutes for your lunch. But I think, do we have the room for a bit longer? Can people eat their lunches? Yes. Yeah, perfect. So I'm just going to leave it there and say thank you so much to Beatrice for organising all of this, and the Heritage Council, and thank all of you for coming along and listening and participating, and all of our speakers today who did an excellent job, and I certainly learned a lot. So thanks everyone.